All right, so let's talk about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle hopefully should be something of a review for you because you should have done some of this when you were in junior high. The goal is that by the end of this, students can describe how carbon moves around the world, both into and out of living organisms. One of the key things to remember throughout this whole thing, that if you remember this, it'll make everything else make a lot more sense, is that there's a fixed amount of carbon in the world. It can just move from place to place to place to place, and through chemical reactions, through living organisms, through weathering, through absorption, things like that. But it's the same amount of carbon, period. So, objective 1 is describe how photosynthesis and cellular respiration contribute to the exchange of carbon between the biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere. Be aware that what we're really looking at here is this part, the exchange of carbon, right? That's what we're really concerned about. These are just locations, biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere are just locations. And photosynthesis and cellular respiration, we're just talking about processes when we talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis, okay? So let's dive in. As a quick recap, photosynthesis is when we capture the energy of the sun in a form of chemical called a sugar, C6H12O6 being the classic example of a sugar. When we do photosynthesis, right, in order to make that, we need carbon dioxide and water, and we combine the energy of the sun in with those things, and we produce this sugar. If we take that sugar and then break it down along with some oxygen, right, that happens at the mitochondria, we get the release of the energy that was originally stored. So it's basically a long way of saying that what we're doing, let me erase that line, is we are taking the light of the sun, right here, and we are saving it so that later we can use it for cellular work. The carbon cycle itself, notice that we have lots and lots and lots and lots of arrows pointing to the atmosphere, right? So many different arrows pointing to the atmosphere. These are all different ways of either doing respiration or burning or in some way releasing the carbon that was trapped in a sugar and bringing it back to the atmosphere. Notice that the only two arrows that we have pointing down and out of the atmosphere are photosynthesis. So this is the one key process that can trap or remove carbon from the atmosphere. Almost every other process will either move carbon into the atmosphere, and there are a couple of different ways that we can move it back into the rock cycle, but in reality, most of those are coming from photosynthesis in the first place anyway. So let's define the four different spheres that we've been talking about. We've talked about the lithosphere, also known as the geosphere, the hydrosphere, which is all the water, and then atmosphere, which is all the air. The biosphere is anything alive. Bio means alive, right? So biosphere is what's driving a lot of this process. It is possible for carbon and other things to move into soil on its, or to water on its own, or out of soil on its own, but 90% of the time, if carbon is being moved from one sphere to another, from the earth into the air, or into the air into the water, or from any of these into living tissues, right? Almost always what drives all of this process is the biosphere itself. So objective 2 is describe how photosynthesis captures energy in sunlight to create chemical products that can be used as food in an ecosystem. In other words, how does photosynthesis create food? Right, which is another way of saying food and captured energy are basically the same thing. So all plants are the things that are capturing the energy of the sun. Always a little fancy sun there. They are capturing the energy from the sun through the process of photosynthesis and storing it as a sugar, C6H12O6. They want it for themselves, but we've got a lot of these very, very rude individuals that will come along, and what they try to do is steal the sugars that were originally captured by the sun and use them for themselves. Plants can do both photosynthesis and respiration. They can both produce a sugar and consume that sugar for energy as needed. Consumers can only do one thing, and one thing only. They can do respiration. That's it. They can steal sugars from other sources and burn them. If it's a primary consumer, what they're saying is that they're eating a producer. and burning the sugars that the producer made. If it's a secondary consumer, they're saying, well, they're stealing the sugars from the primary consumer who originally got them from the producer, and they're going to burn those sugars there for energy. If it's a tertiary, we're saying we're stealing it from the bluebird, right, the secondary consumer, and the secondary consumer is getting it from the primary consumer who got it from the sugar. So we can go all the way up to quaternary, and we can just keep on going up this chain, but in the end, all sugars are produced here at the bottom of the food chain because they're the only things that can capture sunlight and turn it into energy. And this is true in any food web we look at. If we were to look at the desert, right, the producer is the grass, right, which could be eaten by the cricket, which is then eaten by a scorpion, which is then eaten by et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Objective 3 is to be able to identify reservoirs, sources, and steps of the carbon cycle. So if we look at the stages of the carbon cycle, first step that we're going to look at, it's kind of a cycle, so there's no real true start, but we're going to go and start looking at photosynthesis, which is when we take the energy of the sun and we trap it as sugars by plants, aka producers. And my thing isn't going to write there because it doesn't like me. Well, let's pretend like I wrote producers there. The next step of the carbon cycle is things need to be either decomposed, which means they just break down into like the soil or anything like that, and then they're broken down by microorganisms, or we get organisms that consume directly these primary things. So either decomposition or respiration is occurring when the sugars that were captured by plants are being broken down and released into the air. Another way of breaking down those sugars and releasing into the air is through combustion, right? Both combustion and respiration, let's go and circle them in red. Both combustion and respiration are ways of releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. Decomposition is really just a specialized form of respiration. The only way that we can bring that carbon out of the air, right, would be photosynthesis. So we get this nice cyclical pattern where factory and vehicle emissions, root respiration, plant respiration, animal respiration, decaying organisms, things like that, all of those things are producing carbon that is as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then we have the one process of photosynthesis that is sticking it back into the rest of the biosphere. This is just another graph showing that, right? Photosynthesis right here is capturing and bringing all those things on. Plant respiration is bringing things out. Human emissions are bringing things out. Microbes are bringing things out. We do have some organisms in the ocean that can go ahead and do photosynthesis, but then there's lots of organisms that are pumping it back out, right? That are pumping that back out. And it is possible for carbon to be not permanently lost, but stored, right? If there's a living organism in the ocean and it dies and it drifts down to the bottom of the ocean and there's nothing using it, then it just sits on the bottom of the ocean. And that's one way to trap carbon. We call that a sink, or that is to say a place to store it. We can see something similar on the land, right? If plants die and then they get trapped underground and they get stored and they get fossilized, that's another way of trapping carbon in that area. If we release a bunch of that carbon from its storage sites, from the bottom of the ocean, from where it's been trapped under the surface of the earth, from burning a bunch of sugars by chopping down trees and burning the sugars that they've trapped, we give off a whole bunch of carbon dioxide. And the more carbon dioxide and other chemicals like methane or water get in the air, when the sun shines down on the sun, the earth will absorb it, but then it will emit a lot of that energy as infrared. Infrared is trapped by carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. So if we have more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it gets stronger and stronger, this effect. The heat that the earth is radiating off gets trapped. That's like a super warm blanket. We call that a word, global warming. Okay, so the source of carbon is anytime we break down a source of carbon and release it back into the atmosphere, we call that a source or a reservoir, and that can contribute to the problem of global warming because our greenhouse effect that we see here on Earth by more carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane in the air gets worse and worse. So let's look at some practice problems. Which of the following correctly describes one way that cellular respiration contributes to the carbon cycle? What I know about cellular respiration and how it contributes is that I know that cellular respiration is going to give off more, that's a horrible color to see, it's going to give off more and more or increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Okay, so I know that about cellular respiration. So let's look for an answer that has something to do with that. Cellular respiration breaks down carbon-based molecules and releases oxygen into the atmosphere. That is not true, so not that one. Cellular respiration helps move carbon from the bodies of living organisms into the atmosphere. Hey, that's true. That's true. That's a good one. Let's see if there's a better answer if that's the only good one. Cellular respiration takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Whoop, that's a no. Okay, so the correct answer in this case would be B. Let's look at another practice. Regular annual fluctuations in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations occur because photosynthesis stops at night while respiration continues. This is true. That's a true statement. Humans influence the carbon dioxide concentrations. Well, that's also true because we burn fossil fuels. Carbon dioxide emissions increase in winter. That is kind of true as well because we tend to burn more fossil fuels during the winter. Plants in the northern hemisphere lose their leaves in winter, meaning that we get a drop in photosynthesis rates, if that's true. So this is saying that regular annual fluctuations in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations occur. Well, we need to talk about annual. The word annual means yearly. So the fact that photosynthesis stops at night while respiration continues is true, but it doesn't have anything to do with the year. That's a daily cycle. Humans influence the carbon dioxide concentrations. That's true, but we're talking about on the annual scale and that it goes up and down. This is just something that increases. Carbon dioxide emissions increase in winter makes a lot of sense, and plants in the northern hemisphere lose their leaves during the winter also makes a lot of sense. My problem is there are plants in the southern hemisphere that also lose their leaves during the winter, which would counterbalance that. So I don't think it's that one. So for me, the only answer that could be correct would be carbon dioxide emissions increase in the winter. How does the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere affect climate? As carbon dioxide concentration increases, temperature decreases. That is not true because the more carbon dioxide, the more heat gets trapped in the air, and so the temperature would actually increase. So it's not that one. As carbon dioxide concentrations increase, temperatures increase. Well, that's true. Let's see if there's any other correct answers. Carbon dioxide concentrations have no effect on climate. We've shown that in studies over and over and over again that there's at least a positive correlation. And as carbon dioxide concentrations increase, temperatures become more random. That is also not true according to the data and the graphing that we've carried out over the past couple of decades. All right, so the correct answer is B. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants, well, I already know that photosynthesis is about making sugar, C6H12O6, and it's not going to let me write again, C6H12O6, right? We're getting more of that, which means we're dropping carbon dioxide concentrations. So automatically I know it's not the first one. Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide. Well, this is true. It is, in fact, turning them into sugars. Turning sugars into energy, that's not true. Sugars are already an energy form of storage, and then none of the choices isn't true. So let's go ahead and go with B, turning carbon dioxide into sugars. A net carbon source is a carbon pool which takes in more carbon than it releases. Since we're talking about sources here, it says the word source, that means something that's giving off carbon, that's going to have to give off more carbon than it releases. So this is a false statement. So it's not true. It is a false statement. I've included this link. It's not a video I'm going to play on this here, but if you want to, if you come and access the slides, or I've also put it into the study guide, you can see it here, and it'll go through a lot of the things that we just discussed. All right, hopefully you do well. See you later.